What's up, Dragon Brood? We've been putting a lot of focus on the new cards that came out in Dominaria United, and for good reason, because we're going to need them to deck build, but one of the things we haven't really talked about is what cards actually got better because of the rotation, and even because of some cards specifically in Dominaria United. That's what I want to cover today, because I think there's some good conversation to be had for some cards that have kind of been like, I don't know, being that like sixth man on the bench, or maybe just being that last card in the rotation that never makes the cut. Now might just be their time. The big one on this list that we're going to start with, though, is Mirror Box. Now, we've been having people trying to get Mirror Box into the list for a while, especially when you still were able to play Bard class, which is now rotating out. However, we are getting a lot of Legends in this set. This opens the door for a lot of possibilities, not to mention that we got a land that helps Legends, we have creatures that care about other Legends, we have like Joda that actually makes your Legends bigger for other Legends being on the field, and you can double that down with Mirror Box. So this can give you a lot of options for growing your creatures, even just setting up basically virtual creature walls that your opponent's going to have trouble punching through if you start getting duplicates of some of them. And this card really just is a lot of fun, honestly. Being able to break the legendary rule and being able to pump your creatures even more is awesome, and it only costs, what, 3 mana? Like, that seems more than worthwhile. But again, we've kind of pushed it to the side because there just hasn't been a world where we could justify playing enough Legends in a deck to make it work. However, now that we have cards that care about other Legends or make them cheaper to cast or give you multicolor stuff or even work if you control another Legend or whatever, like if there's a Legend themed deck, which I think there's going to be at least one, this card could actually finally have its moment in the sun. Okay, this one's a little more mundane, but Cemetery Prowler. And this is for a few reasons. I think that the whole Gruul Werewolves thing is still viable. I think that deck's still playable, and it picked up a few simple tools. Obviously no new werewolves because they don't exist in Dominaria. But this card kind of got pushed aside because we just had a bunch of other things that were still playable on the list, and you have to start squeezing for space at some point. However, this ends up being a pretty quality creature as a 3/4, which is awesome. But the upside of being able to remove stuff from a graveyard is actually pretty big, and it has vigilance, so attacking and blocking with the same creature is usually pretty quick, or pretty good, not quick. It's slow, but it's good. Anyway, back to the point. We do know that this set also brings in a lot of things that care about stuff being in the graveyard. Now, we do have others in this cycle of cards that remove stuff from the graveyard, blah, 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 but this seems to be the one that's going to be the most playable going forward. And I think that could actually be key, because not just are you able to remove stuff from graveyards, particularly if you're removing creatures, then it's going to make your other stuff cheaper. And we have several creatures in this set that are very, very close to being good or better, playable, maybe even dominant, if you could get them for 1 mana, 2 mana cheaper. So it's something to consider here. Now, are we going to play this outside of werewolf decks? That part I don't know. Maybe you're going to play this in some version of Gruul aggro decks that happen to not be werewolves, because it does have double green in the cost, so you do have to commit to it somewhat, but it could have a pretty big payoff. And maybe this is one of the new tools for mono green, because obviously we lost the 2 mana werewolf, we lost the troll, so you're going to have to start replacing them with something. But there are some worlds where you could play this on 3 and then play the big Defiler on 4, and now you have a pretty sizable board, and the next thing you play is going to pump your team. Like, that seems like it could be a very viable direction for mono green. We'll just have to wait and see, but I do think that this whole cemetery dude could get some work done. We're also adding to this list Kodama of the West Tree. Now, I did have Kodama in a couple of lists that really were different types of modified lists, putting counters on things, using equipment, and I think that's still going to be able to continue forward. And we got a couple of new cards that care about +1/+1s. We also got a really good 2 mana creature, which is something that these decks didn't really have, that automatically gets counters on it. So now you have a situation where you can have Quirion Beastcaller on 2, or maybe even your Gallagreators on 2, and now you are almost always going to guarantee that your turn 2 creature is going to start with a +1/+1 counter on it on the turn you play Kodama right on tempo. And I think that's a thing we weren't able to do before, at least guarantee. And now I think this increases the odds of that happening pretty highly. So you could be both having a reasonable size board and also ramp up for the next turn, all on that turn 3, which could be pretty powerful in a few different builds. So this is something I'm going to be looking for this card, because I think it's going to get work in some spots we weren't really expecting. And, you know, the Defiler we just mentioned as well, the green Defiler is actually pretty good here as well because you could play Kodama on the following turn. Now everything has a +1/+1 counter. When they attack, you're going to also get those lands out of your deck. The question might come down to, are we able to play enough basics depending on how we build our decks? And then that's going to be a whole question, adventure all its own. But I do think it's actually something worth considering, and this actually gets a little more play now, so I'm going to be looking at squeezing this into a few decks in the first couple of weeks. Next up, we've got Sigarda, Champion of the Light. And this one's one that's not really tricky. There's not really a particular plan as to what you're going to do with this. This is just the fact that Dominaria United brought a lot of human cards to the format. Now, some are human soldiers and some are like various other things, but the fact of the matter is, you got a lot more humans, and that's what this card cares about. And we already had some versions of like Selesnya humans and Naya humans. This is just going to push those up a level. Now, one of the things I will note is that several of the things that make tokens in white happen to make 1/1 soldiers that don't have another type. So they're not human soldiers, they're just soldiers. That aside, I think there still are enough things that actually make human tokens and just are human on their own to make having Sigarda worthwhile. And consider the fact now that you can play Sigarda alongside King Darien, extra large the 8th, but that's going to give you a lot of ways to pump your teams, and that's before you decide to maybe still splash into red to play Halana and Alena partners or whatever, right? So there's going to be a lot of ways for these white human decks to be able to really boost up their team and keep coming at you turn after turn after turn. This could be a real deal situation here, because in a lot of ways we had Sigarda at the top being the thing that could pump your team, and then maybe you got like an adversary or something if you were lucky between then, right? Now you're going to have adversaries, King Darien, and Sigarda at a minimum, and that's if you don't go and splash something else. So I think those decks could be getting a boost, and part of that could be because Sigarda is going to be tag teaming with some other new creatures as well. Now, here's one you probably are a little surprised to hear me add to the list, but Teferi, Who Slows the Sunset. And the reason is I think Teferi was on the cusp of being playable for quite a bit. And we did lose Duress, which is the card, the discard of choice that a lot of decks wanted to splash. A lot of the other discard isn't so good against Teferi, so I think that helps its case a little bit. But we do have a couple of other artifacts and some creatures that care about creatures or artifacts being tapped. So this could work alongside those. So it may not even go into just control style decks, which is kind of where Teferi's been relegated. It might actually make sense to play it in some type of creature decks, especially if you want to be able to attack with some things and then untap them, or maybe leave mana open to kill an attacker, who knows what, right? There's a few different things you could do with this card in those scenarios. And again, we do have a lot of cards that care about legendary permanents, so maybe it squeezes into something there. I don't know if that's 100% true just yet. Again, it's still early. We haven't really done a bunch of theory crafting yet. But when looking around the format and the cards that are available, I could see worlds where there's some mid-rangey decks that are now wanting to splash Teferi, which is actually pretty damn cool. Honestly, it's not something I considered up until I was making these lists, but this is definitely a card that could be better here on the, second half of its life in Standard than the first half. And then the last card on our list is Urabrask, Heretic, Preator. And the reason I bring this up is we kind of had, and we talked about this on a video, I believe like maybe 2 weeks ago, possibly 3 weeks ago, where like what we were going to do whenever we didn't have access to Goldspan Dragon. Well, now we're at that point, and you have to start thinking about like what are we trying to do with our other cards. Well, something like this is actually still really good. Urabrask costs the same, so no real loss there, and also has the same size body. Now, admittedly, they both have haste, but Goldspan Dragon obviously makes treasure and flies, and there's no real replacement for that. But the upside on Urabrask could be very good, especially if we end up in a bit of a slower meta at some point, where you're up against some really slow grindy decks, or maybe even up against some type of Azorius control decks, because you reach a point where their things like counters and whatnot lose a lot of their value, because they have to use it or lose it on their draw step. And then there's also the other possibility that even if it is something that targets a creature or whatever, they kind of have to use it right then. They can't wait until you commit to a decision. And I think just those little tweaks could actually change the game state enough to make Urabrask worth playing. And there's also the reality of there's still a bunch of things that care about haste, right? And we could just lean in on that and say, do you want to play all hasty deck and have Urabrask be your upper end? That's a realistic scenario that you could go with. So I do think this card is at least worth experimenting with. I don't think this is like, you know, Goldspan Dragon play 4 of. I mean, obviously this is also legendary, so it has that roadblock to it. But again, if it fits into legendary decks, maybe it also finds a home there, and you're getting to draw a second card, which gives you access to more things. So I don't know. There's going to be a few spots where this might be better for certain metas than a Goldspan Dragon. Now, that's not going to be very often. Oh, totally going to be aware of that. Goldspan Dragon was an uncomparable card. It's super good. But I do think we at least need to pay some attention to Urabrask, because I think there's some scenarios now where it's playable where there were almost none before. This is one of those things where I think if you're looking for value, these are cards that you could really kind of dig into, pick them up if you find some cheap or find some deals, because there's an opportunity here. Now, I don't think any of them are going to just shoot up into crazy value, but they will likely go up as the season goes on and people find uses for them. But yeah, are there any other cards you've been waiting to have their moment in the sun that I just didn't include or maybe even forgot about, honestly? I'd like to know. Let me know in the comments. And if you just want to know what other cards are a bit overhyped and overrated right now, check out this other video that I've got set up for you.